So this is part 2 of my Raspberry Pi Kubernetes home lab. So I've got a bunch of Raspberry Pis from part 1. I've hooked them up to a network switch. They've all got IP addresses, and I've formatted their SD cards with the Ubuntu operating systems. In part 1, we went over the architecture that we're kind of going for and how I'm going to go about this process. So this is part 2, where I'm configuring the host, and I'm taking that process of configuring them and attempting to automate it. So configuring the host, what we're going to do is I'm going to set host names, apply an etc host file because I don't have a DNS server yet, add an administrator user, add a root password, lock the default Ubuntu account, and apply a login banner. And then I'm going to take all those manual steps and I'm going to put them into Ansible Playbooks to make the process repeatable. I'm going to be using Git for source code management, so I'm restoring all the Ansible playbooks in GitHub. I'm going to put the link in the description, but the link's right there as well. I'm going to include the manual commands for everything that I'm putting into an Ansible playbook, right? So if I create a Ansible role to change the host name, in the README of that role in the Git repo, you'll find how to set the host name manually in case you don't have access to Ansible or you don't want to use Ansible. For instance, if I use the hostname module in Ansible to set the hostname, the hostname ctl set hostname file will be in the README. And then I'm going to be using Ansible Vault as well a little bit here. I'm not going to give a whole lesson on it, but if you go to the README as well, you'll see how to create a vault password file, add a .gitignore, hash a password, and then use Ansible Vault to encrypt a string. And that's what that looks like a little bit here on the right hand side. So once you've got the operating system installed on the Raspberry Pi and you verified that you can connect and you've got all your IP addresses gathered up, you need to set the IP address statically in one of two ways. You can actually set a static IP address, or you can leave it DHCP, the interface as DHCP, and create a DHCP reservation from your DHCP server or /router. So if you wanted to set it on the Raspberry Pis as static, you go to SCNetplan and there'll be a file in here. And in part 1, I show how to do this near the end of the video, and I also link a description to it. I'll link a description on how to do this again. But you would basically turn DHCP4 off, and you would define your IP address and your gateway and your network prefix and your DNS server. Or the second way, like I said, here you can see that in my router I can set DHCP address reservations. So when the Raspberry Pi boots up, the MAC address reaches out for a DHCP address. It's going to see that that MAC address has a reserved IP address, and my systems are going to get the same IP address every single time they boot up. Now you probably saw there that my hostname was already configured on that one worker, but I've created the next step once you've got these static IP addresses assigned is to configure the host. And the first step in configuring the host for me is setting a host name, right? So I've got a main playbook here, configure cluster, and it's going to call my roles for configuring the cluster. And then I've got my host file already defined. I've got all of my hosts. I've got some children. I divided them up by workers, masters, load balancers, management. So you can see that configure cluster is going to call host all. So it's going to see all, and it's going to call all of these hosts for the roles here. So then we have this role configure hosts, and like I said, we're starting off, here's my roles, we're starting off with assigning the host name, right? So I've defined a variable, using the hostname module, defined a variable for each host when the inventory host name is defined as a certain IP address. So this IP address will be this worker, this IP address will be this worker, and those are defined in the variables file within the roles directory. So here's the hostname variable and the hostname. And then I've also got a group vars file up here where I call out the Ansible Python interpreter as Python 3. because the Ubuntu servers, they came with Python 3, not Python 2, and just to avoid any bugs, I like to call out the Ansible Python interpreter version in my playbook. So if I go ahead and let's take a look at the configure cluster.yaml. No, let's take a look at the tasks here in this role, right? So I'm actually going to go ahead and run this now. Ansible sudo Ansible Playbook -I using my host.yaml file, calling the configure cluster playbook using the user Ubuntu. And by the way, you can set a user on every machine that you want, but since they already come with Ubuntu, just for ease of use for now, I'm going to keep it that way, and -K to prompt me for password. And I've changed the ansible.cfg file actually. So if I cat ants, or actually if I vi ansible.cfg, I've turned host key checking off because I haven't distributed a key to everything. You know, in a best practice security scenario, you would want to create SSH keys and for the Ubuntu user and distribute it to every system. But for now, I'm just doing the password. So I'm going to go ahead and run this command now. And it's going to go through and gather facts, and then it's going to go ahead and set the host name for each of these servers based on their IP address. And I'm also storing all of these playbooks up in a Git repository. So if you're welcome to clone that repo, pull it, fork it, whatever you want to do for your own use in your own Kubernetes lab. And you'll see here I did put use cmd systemd in the first one. That was just me playing around with some of the options for the hostname module. But you can see it's not in the other ones and it's running just fine. But to avoid, if you're going to do it on another operating systems, you might run into errors. So there's a bunch of different options you can define for use. Just look that up in the Ansible hostname module documentation. So now that I have the host names defined, you would think you'd be able to reach those hosts by their host name, right? But you can see here I try to ping Kate's worker01 and it says name or service not known. That's because I don't have a private DNS server set up. So you can either set up a private DNS server or you can edit the etc host file on all of these hosts to let them know, hey, these IP addresses correspond to these host names. So if I sudo vi etc host here, and I've got this address here. We'll do the first one just to test it. And I know that corresponds to K8's worker01, right? So then I'll try and ping that again. And now I'm pinging. So I have to put all of these IP addresses and host names in etc host and then distribute that to all of these hosts. And the way I'm going to do that is through the template module using a Jitsi template. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in the etc host file, and then real quick I'll write the playbook to distribute that, and we'll distribute it. So I've got all my host names associated with their IP addresses in etc host on my VM. So now Ansible can actually reach out and hit all these servers in order to place the same etc host file on all of these servers. So if I ping K8's let's do management 01 real quick. Let's ping it. So I know they're all working. So now I need to distribute this to all these. So still using the, let's call it, still using the configure host role, right? Let's make a role to copy templates. So name, copy etc host. And we're going to use the template module. And we're going to use source, let's say Let me create a template here, new file, host.j2. And the reason I like using J2 templates is because I can take, paste this here. All right, these are, I want to decouple, you know, these addresses and these host names as much as I can from this workbook in case I have to use it later on in a different environment with different host names and different IP addresses. And Jinja templates allow me to put variables inside them that Ansible would recognize, right? So when it installs this, it'll recognize those variables the same way it would when it runs a playbook to recognize variables, if that makes sense. Anyway, so what I'm going to do in order to decouple this, these host names and these IP addresses from this playbook to make it more dynamic, so you can take it into any environment, is I'm going to replace these actually with the variables. So let me pop this out here. And now I've got these side by side. Okay. So I want to do worker address 1 variable here. And the host name, worker, okay, it's worker 01 host name, right? Over here. So I'm going to go ahead and go through all of these. I'm going to speed up the video real quick, and then we'll push it out and we'll see if it works. So now that I got the etc host template built, using the variables pulled from the same configure host role directory structure under vars, I can go back to my main task for the role here and continue building the template task here. So source is going to be host.j2, destination is going to be etc host. Where do I want to place the file? And then I'm going to give it a tag here, tags, in case we just want to run this one part of the playbook and, you know, not run the change hostname part later on down the line. And we'll call it, we'll just call it hosts for the tag name. Oh, actually, always give a description. Copy etc host file. And we're going to go ahead and run that. Okay, so it says the template was successfully applied. So let's see if my syntax in the J2 template was correct. So to do that, let's SSH here into worker 1, K8 worker 01. Yes. Oh, it's trying to go in as user, which doesn't exist. So if I cat etc host, and we can see it's all there. But I did make a fatal mistake here that I just thought of. I took out the loopback address. So I'm going to go back here. So I went ahead and reran that playbook, but I just want to make a note here. I actually did it with the -- tags hosts, because when we, where is the role? When we included that task into this role, we actually tagged it with hosts, and that allowed me to skip actually all the apply hostname tasks. So I didn't waste time rerunning over those. And that's just a neat little trick, and that's why we include tags in Ansible. And then now that I've made a change to this Ansible code here, and I've successfully verified that it works, I'm gonna go ahead and push it to my Git repo here. Let's see, host template. And that way I can keep all my code synced up in Git. So like I said earlier, I'm including the manual commands for all of these. They're correlating Ansible modules in the README. So if you pull in the Git repo and you go over to the role configure host and go to the readme.md, you will see the manual commands that correspond to everything we're doing with Ansible, in case you don't want to use Ansible. So if you want us to know how to set the host name, you do a hostname ctl set host name, how to add a user, change a password, lock the account, all that good stuff is in the README, along with encrypting passwords if you're going to use Ansible, and using Ansible Vault and making a hash. So if we go back to the tasks here, we ended at applying the etc host file. I went ahead and added the rest of the tasks in here for configuring the host that we're going to use for the rest of the video. And I'll just go over them real quick. So we're going to change the root password because these systems didn't come with a root password, but I want one set in the event I need to go through a terminal. It makes my life easier. I'm creating a Kubernetes admin. It's going to have the ability to sudo, and it's going to generate an SSH key and a home directory as well. I'm going to lock the default Ubuntu account because I don't need it anymore, and it's the default one. I don't want it there anymore. Well, I'm going to keep it there. I'm just going to lock the password. Not to say if if it had an SSH key generated, someone could still get in that way. We're just locking the password. And then we're going to change the login banner by applying a template to etc issue. And we're going to change sshd config to use etc issue for the banner. And we're going to restart the sshd service. So going back up here, I'll go over this real quick. Change root password, right? So the user module, if you're going to change the password of an account that already exists, you're going to have to do update password always. And if you're going to use the password command in the user module, it has to be hashed. And what I mean by that is if you go into the command line, you just do a make password and specify a hash method, right? It's going to ask you for a password, and it's going to spit out a hash of that password. And that's going to have to be the variable that gets put in here, or it's not going to work. So root password is my variable. So if I go to my variables, you can see I have root password defined, but I've also encrypted this hash that got generated with Ansible Vault. So if you actually go over to the README and you go down to the encrypting password section, you can see I have how to hash it, but I also have the Ansible Vault encrypt string command here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to paste it in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the hashed password to encrypt line here. And I'm actually going to paste this hashed password to encrypt into here. And that's going to actually spit out what happened. What doesn't it like? Oh, I have to see it. Just because of the way I installed Ansible, I have to sudo when I use Ansible commands. That's unique to me, not you. And then it spits out my variable saying that it's encrypted with Ansible Vault. So then when the playbook runs, it's going to decrypt this. It's going to decrypt this variable with Ansible Vault. And I've included, how to make a pass.vault file and what to put in it and how to use your ansible.config to call that out and define that. And you can find that all in the README. I'm not going to go over it right now. But that's the change the root password. And then the same for the add the Kubernetes, the K8's admin user, right? So I'm defining the name of the admin in the variables. So the Kubernetes admin, K8's admin. And then again, I have a hashed password encrypted with Ansible Vault. And that gets put for password. The default shell, a comment, the group it's going to be appended to, because append yes, append the group sudo, create the home directory and generate SSH keys. And then we lock the default Ubuntu account. So again, it's the user module. Which user do you want to affect password lock? Yes. change the login banner. So I'm just using a template, a J2 template, issue.j2. I like Moogles. And I'm just placing it as the issue. And then we have to edit the SSHD config because by default it comes with the banner none line in this file. We have to change it to banner etc issue. And I'm using the replace module, which is just looking for this line, and it's going to replace it with this line, the first one it hits. And then we have to restart the SSHD service for those changes to take effect. And we're using the service module, and we just define which service do you want to affect, start, restart, enable, stop, and the state of that service. In this case, we want to restart it, so it's restarted. Now, I just want to mention it's also important to remember that before we were running our playbooks, before we created the K8s admin using -u user ubuntu and a lowercase k for the SSH password. Now that we've locked the Ubuntu account and created the K8s admin account, we need to stop using Ubuntu and replace it with the K8s admin account. And we also need to find a capital K for the sudo up password. So when K8s admin SSH is in and tries to become sudo, it's going to use the capital K password for the sudo password, and the lowercase password is for the SSH password. So now I'm just going to go ahead and run this. So you can see that, you know, everything that I have here currently is pushed up into GitHub, and it's all going to work. I'm just going to watch it run real quick, and then in the next video, part 3, I'm actually going to be starting to install the necessary packages and software for the Kubernetes cluster to run, possibly set up some roles for firewall management as well, and then we'll go from there. So it's just running through and it's assigning host names based on the IP. They're already set, so it's green for OK. Configuring hosts, copy as the host. We did that earlier. I've already run this, so everything's already configured. Change the root password, OK. Add the K8s admin. Lock the default Ubuntu account. Change the login banner. Change SSHD config to use the login banner and restart the SSHD service. And that's always going to restart. And just to prove to you that it works, we're going to SSH here K8s admin at K8s worker01. We got our login banner there. Enter our password. And we want a sudo. We'll do sudo -i, sudo password, and we're in. And just to prove we can switch to root because we set a root password,